When historian Bruce Catton discovered a letter forgotten for 89 years in the National Archives in Washington, he never imagined that two words scrawled by a Union general on February 16, 1862, would forever change our understanding of American leadership. For 25 years, Catton had studied every battle, every decision, every moment of the Civil War. But it was only when he held that yellow document from Fort Donelson, Tennessee, a telegraphic response of just 8 words, that his life as a historian changed forever. What Catton discovered in those lines was not just a military response. It was the birth certificate of a new America. And it all began with 2 words an unknown general sent to Confederate commander Simon Bolivar Buckner on a freezing winter morning that defined not only the Civil War, but the very essence of American determination. In 1862, the Union had lost 7 of the last 9 major battles. The troops were demoralized, and Lincoln was considering firing all his generals. But at Fort Donelson, everything changed because of those 2 words. This discovery would revolutionize not only military history, but our understanding of what makes someone truly unstoppable. Bruce Catton was never just a historian. He was an obsessive detective of the American soul. For decades, he pursued a question that kept him up at night. What really transformed Ulysses S. Grant from a failed shopkeeper in Illinois into the savior of the Union? Catton realized that, up to that point, all of Grant's biographers had focused on his great final victories: Vicksburg, Chattanooga, the Wilderness, Appomattox. But then he understood something revolutionary. Great revelations about leadership don't happen in moments of triumph. They happen in moments when an ordinary man must choose between being ordinary and being immortal. For years, Catton had followed in the footsteps of other historians, analyzing the same famous campaigns, the same known speeches. He knew he was missing something crucial, something that would explain why Grant succeeded where brilliant generals like McClellan, Pope, and Burnside had failed. Catton's obsession began when, as a young journalist, he covered the 75th anniversary of Gettysburg in 1938. Centenarian veterans from both sides were still alive, and something they said about Grant haunted him. He was different from the others. When Grant spoke, you knew he meant business. But what exactly had Grant said that was so different? Catton had visited every battlefield, read every biography, interviewed descendants of soldiers. But the central piece of the puzzle remained hidden somewhere in the nation's vast archives. Bruce Catton's journey through the National Archives had spanned more than 2 decades. He had examined thousands of documents, battle reports, military correspondence, and personal diaries of soldiers. Each visit to Washington was a new hope. In 1951, he almost gave up. He had spent months analyzing reports on Grant's early campaigns in Tennessee, but they all told the same superficial story he already knew. In 1952, a discovery about the correspondence between Grant and Halleck temporarily encouraged him, but he soon realized it was just more military protocol. Within March 1953, while researching his book A Stillness at Appomattox, that Catton discovered that letter. He had spent the entire day at the archives, as he had religiously for years. His hands were smudged with dust, his eyes tired from 19th century manuscripts, but something about that yellowed envelope magnetically attracted his attention. The document was poorly cataloged, almost lost among supply reports and administrative correspondence from the Department of Tennessee. But the header caught his eye. General Grant's response to General Buckner, Fort Donelson, February 16, 1862, 7:30 a.m. Catton read that line and felt his heart race. In his entire career, he had never found military correspondence so specific about such a precise time. Most military reports spoke in terms of dates, weeks, campaigns, but this one spoke of a specific morning, a specific moment. When Catton opened the document, his hands trembled slightly, and then he saw it. 8 handwritten words that would change his understanding of leadership forever. That night, Catton couldn't sleep. He knew he had found not just a historical document, but the exact moment when the American character was forged in 2 simple words. During his research, Catton realized that morning of February 16, 1862, at Fort Donelson, was not just another Civil War battle. It was the exact moment when Ulysses S. Grant transformed from a regional commander into a force of nature. To understand what Catton discovered, we need to go back to that freezing morning in Tennessee. The Battle of Fort Donelson had become a nightmare for both sides. Grant had surrounded the Confederate fortress with 25,000 men, but the Confederates, commanded by John Floyd, Gideon Pillow, and Simon Bolivar Buckner, you're still resisting fiercely. In the early hours of the 16th, something desperate happened. The Confederates launched a massive surprise attack against Grant's right flank, commanded by General McClernand. Within hours, the entire Union line collapsed. Federal soldiers were in a desperate retreat through the snow-covered hills. It was the perfect moment for the Confederates to escape, just as they had planned. Grant was not even present when the attack began. He was meeting with Admiral Foote downriver, discussing naval strategies. When he returned and saw the chaos, his own officer suggested an immediate retreat. But Catton discovered that in that moment of absolute chaos, Grant did something that changed not only that battle but the entire war. Instead of retreating, he gathered his commanders and said something no Union general had said before. "We attack. If they can attack our right, it means they have weakened their own line somewhere else." Catton immediately realized that this order wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. Grant was betting everything on something no general had tried before, turning an imminent defeat into a declaration of intent about who he truly was. By 3 p.m. on the 16th, Grant's counterattacks had not only recovered the lost ground, but completely surrounded Fort Donelson. The Confederates were cornered, with no escape routes and supplies running out. During the night, something extraordinary happened in the Confederate quarters. The three generals, Floyd, Pillow, and Buckner, met to decide the fortress's fate. Floyd and Pillow, fearing capture and trial for treason, fled during the night, leaving Buckner alone with 12,000 cornered soldiers. It was then that Buckner, an old friend of Grant from their West Point days, did what any honorable general would do. He sent a letter proposing to negotiate the terms of surrender. Catton discovered in Confederate reports that they expected standard military protocol, negotiations on conditions, treatment of prisoners, preservation of personal property, permission for officers to keep their swords and horses. This was how civilized war worked between gentlemen, but the response Grant sent at 7:30 a.m. was not civilized. It was revolutionary. Catton held in his trembling hands the document that changed the American Civil War. Two words that defined not just Grant, but the very soul of American determination. Bruce Catton never imagined that discovery would lead him to completely rewrite his understanding of American leadership. Grant's two words weren't about military tactics. They were about the psychology of absolute victory. It was 2:30 a.m. when Catton finally grasped the true meaning of those words. He was at his study desk in Benzonia, Michigan, surrounded by hundreds of documents about Fort Donelson, when the epiphany hit him like a lightning bolt. Grant's full response to Buckner was, "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works. Unconditional surrender." Catton realized that Grant had not only rejected negotiation, he had completely reinvented the concept of American victory. For the first time in U.S. military history, a general said, "I don't negotiate. You surrender completely, or we keep fighting." Catton discovered something even more extraordinary in the diaries of Confederate soldiers. When Grant's response was read at Fort Donelson, the silence was total. A Southern officer wrote, "We had never met a Yankee who didn't want to negotiate. This Grant is different. We finally have a general who doesn't retreat," a Union soldier wrote. "Grant knows no half measures," another noted. Catton understood that those two words, unconditional surrender, were not just a military response. They were the moment Grant became a legend in the minds of his own men. It was at that moment in Catton's career that he understood the deepest truth about leadership. Great leaders are not born ready. They are forged in the moment they choose between compromise and absolute conviction. And Grant had chosen conviction at 7:30 on that freezing morning. Catton's discovery began to connect dots no one had seen before. Those two words at Fort Donelson explained everything that came after. Vicksburg, where Grant said, "The city surrenders, or it will be taken." The Wilderness, where he said, "I do not retreat, I advance." Appomattox, where he accepted only Lee's total surrender. Grant had become psychologically unstoppable because he had discovered that unconditional surrender was not just a military demand. It was a philosophy of life. You either win completely or you die trying. There is no middle ground. Catton realized that America had been born a second time at Fort Donelson. The first time was in 1776, when the colonists said no to the king. The second was in 1862, when Grant said no to the Southern culture of honor and compromise that had paralyzed every Union general before him. When Catton began to share his discovery with other historians, the reaction was one of complete shock. Colleagues who had studied Grant for decades realized they had missed the most defining moment of his entire career. The two words that made him immortal were hidden in a routine response to a Confederate general. Catton's discovery about unconditional surrender faced initial skepticism from the historical community. How could two simple words be so defining? Catton knew he needed more evidence. He returned to the archives with a new purpose. This time, he wasn't looking for Grant. He was looking for the reflections of those two words in everything that came after Fort Donelson. What he found completely validated his theory. In newspapers of the time, Catton found direct references to the national impact of Grant's words. The New York Tribune published, "We finally have a general who speaks the language of victory." Harper's Weekly wrote, "Unconditional surrender Grant has become the name on the lips of every patriot." Even more revealing were the Confederate documents Catton discovered. Jefferson Davis had ordered his generals to specifically study Grant's response at Fort Donelson. "We need to understand what kind of enemy we face," a Confederate military order said. "He is not like the other Yankee generals." Catton found diaries of Confederate soldiers that confirmed the psychological impact. "After Fort Donelson, we knew we were facing a different kind of commander," a rebel officer wrote. "He doesn't negotiate when he should negotiate. He doesn't retreat when he should retreat." The most impressive evidence came from an unexpected source, the Union War Department's own reports. After Fort Donelson, voluntary enlistment rates in the North increased by 340%. Citizens were not just supporting the war. They believed they finally had a general who knew how to win. Catton discovered that Lincoln had been immediately captivated by the two words. In a letter to Grant dated February 20th, 1862, the president wrote, "The nation is proud of a general who knows the meaning of the word victory." Lincoln had found his war general. Catton found evidence that unconditional surrender became not just a military strategy, but a national philosophy. Northern newspapers began using the phrase in editorials about politics, business, even sports. America had adopted a new mentality: win completely or not win at all. But Catton's most extraordinary discovery came from Grant's own personal letters. Writing to his wife Julia, a week after Fort Donelson, Grant revealed, "I have discovered something about myself in this war. I do not know how to negotiate half measures. It is total victory or nothing." Catton realized that Grant had found his true identity in that moment. The man who had failed as a shopkeeper, a farmer, a salesman, had discovered that his nature was that of an absolute winner. Unconditional surrender was not just his demand to his enemies, it was his promise to himself. When Catton finally presented his discovery about unconditional surrender in 1953, through a stillness at Appomattox, the historical community was shocked. Historians who had studied Grant for decades realized they had missed the most defining moment of his entire career. "I spent 20 years looking for Grant's secret in the great campaigns," Catton admitted in later interviews. But the real Grant was hidden in an 8-word response that everyone considered just routine military protocol. That discovery transformed not only Catton's career, but the entire modern understanding of American leadership. He had proven that historical moments are not defined by grand speeches or complex strategies. They are defined by two words that reveal a man's character: Today, in military academies around the world, unconditional surrender is studied as the perfect example of decisive leadership.
Catton had discovered that Grant was not just a general. He was an intuitive psychologist who understood how to transform language into power.
At Harvard Business School, executives studied Grant's 2 words as an example of leadership communication. At West Point, cadets analyze how an 8-word response can change the course of history. In American politics, unconditional surrender has become synonymous with presidential determination.
Catton spent the rest of his career exploring the implications of that discovery.
In Grant Takes Command, 1969, he revealed how those 2 words shaped every one of Grant's subsequent decisions. Vicksburg, the Wilderness; Petersburg, Appomattox.
Catton discovered that unconditional surrender had become the DNA of the American victory mindset. When Harry Truman faced the decision about Japan in 1945, he directly quoted Grant, "Unconditional surrender or we continue fighting." When John F. Kennedy faced the Cuban Missile Crisis, his advisors referred to the Grant philosophy, zero negotiation with existential enemies. In his last interviews before his death in 1978, Catton often said that those 2 words taught him more about the American character than decades of academic study. Grant had discovered something that transcended war: how to become unstoppable through the absolute refusal to accept less than total victory. Catton realized that unconditional surrender explained not only Grant's military success, but the character of America itself. A nation that does not negotiate its fundamental principles, a culture that demands complete victory or death trying. A philosophy that transformed an agrarian republic into a global superpower.
Bruce Catton visited Fort Donelson dozens of times after his discovery. He would often stand at the exact spot where Grant wrote that historic response, trying to feel what the general had felt on that freezing February morning. Grant was not a traditional military genius, Catton wrote in his memoirs. He was something much rarer, a man who had discovered how to become immortal through 2 words that defined his soul. That 8-word letter that Catton discovered in 1953 is still preserved in the National Archives. Its true importance is not in the paper. It is in the lesson that Catton extracted from it, that true leaders are not defined by their natural talents, but by their willingness to demand total victory when everyone else accepts compromise. Grant proved he was immortal with unconditional surrender.
Catton proved he was a genius by discovering the meaning of those words.
And what about us? We have the opportunity to apply this transformative philosophy to our own lives, because we all have our Fort Donelson moment coming. The question is, when it arrives, will you negotiate half measures like everyone else, or will you demand unconditional surrender from your own limits like Grant?
If Bruce Catton's obsessive journey through American history has touched you as much as it has touched millions around the world, subscribe to the channel to discover more explosive revelations that forever changed our understanding of leadership, determination, and American character. And tell us in the comments, what is your version of unconditional surrender? What 2 words would define your absolute refusal to accept anything less than total victory in your own life?